Hello, and welcome to After Office Hours, the show where we talk with professors about topics that interest them outside our classes. I'm Hannah Niemeier. I'm the Culture Section Editor at the Hillsdale Collegian, and I'm here today with Dr. Barbara Bushey, who's a professor of art and an artist herself. She works with textiles. Today we're going to talk about modern art, which is kind of an intimidating and sometimes suspicious topic for students here at Hillsdale, because we tend to study more classical art. So we're going to talk about how has art changed, how's the way we approach it changed, and how can we better understand it. So Dr. Bushey, you teach art history classes, so you kind of know the whole wide scope of art. Can you give us a brief history of kind of how we got to modern art today?
Sure. I think that one thing to remember, obviously in this discussion I have to start somewhere, and but the real issue is that it's not as simple as I'm going to start here. There are things that maybe lead us on a path that we can keep going back and back and back and say, oh, this sort of did it too. But typically, I would argue that modern art really began in the middle of the 19th century. We have the realists. Courbet famously says, "Show me an angel and I will paint one." And so, he's saying no religious art, no history painting, and throughout most of from the Renaissance through the Baroque period into neoclassicism, history painting was what art was. That was, you maybe knocked off a few portraits or a few landscapes, but that was just to learn to mix color and do those sorts of things. So history painting was always what art was. And, suddenly, no, maybe not. And then the other thing that art always had been was whatever the Academy said it was. And Napoleon III says, oh boy, you kind of said no to a lot of people this year. So in 1863, he sets up a second display of the rejected works of art, thereby essentially saying there is no one standard by which we can say what art is. And then the Impressionists come along with a kind of, it's not a really new idea in many ways. They were very interested in color, and color had been the topic of much discussion throughout the years of the French Academy. The followers of Poussin saying that color was cheap and tawdry and just to attract the masses, and drawing was essential and it was what appealed to the mind. And they were in disagreement with the followers of Rubens, who said, no, color's cool. let's use color. And so that had gone back and forth a lot, and indeed even the Academy kind of bowed to the Rubenists when they allowed for a new category of painting, fête galante, because they wanted Watteau in the Academy. But with the Impressionists, they, in addition to kind of changing the way that they painted very directly, capturing the color as they saw it with a sort of naive eye rather than creating something perfect. So that was a switch, admittedly, but they also took over the way their art was sold. They sold it themselves, and that was kind of a rejection of the way things had been done. So it wasn't entirely about the sort of manufacture, if you will. And then in the wake of the Impressionists, we have Cézanne coming along, and he is at once both enamored of Poussin and enamored of the Impressionists. And so he said, I want to make of the Impressionists something of like the art of the museums. I want to make it solid and geometric and so forth. And so he's constantly working with an intellectual approach, how do I create these volumes in space? But he's also really fascinated by just putting paint on the surface of a canvas. And so he's also then ultimately, I guess I would say, interested in the tension between those two things, between making a picture and making a painting. And I think what happens largely, I'm trying to do this fast, right? So there are all these there are all these subtleties that have to fall by the side of the road. But with the invention of photography, suddenly there's a machine that can make a picture. So that's another reason why the Impressionists were so interested in color, because that machine at that point couldn't make color. So that was the one thing sort of left to artists. So this interest in color, this interest in painting as opposed to picture making, continues, and so we have Cubism, which really rejects the whole tradition of Renaissance perspective of what the world looks like from, or to, I guess I should say, what the world looks like to a one-eyed stationary viewer. That's how you set up that whole mathematical system. And Picasso says, let's look at the world from many different viewpoints at once. Let's not have a preferred viewer. And that's interesting because that's happening at a time that, of course, Einstein is saying there is no preferred observer. The only constant is the speed of light. So, that's going on in the world. The next thing that really kind of, there's two things going on at once, I guess. One is a desire for a kind of universal statement, wanting to express a particular philosophy. And there are many different schools of art who had many different philosophies, but they all thought that they could express this in their art. At the same time, what happens, moving quickly through the 20th century, in the course of in the wake, I guess I should say, of World War II, realism or any picture making becomes suspect because of the style of art that was celebrated by the Nazis and by the Stalinists. And it was all those big, strong women with scythes in the fields and so forth. And so the realistic painting and sculpture became tainted with essence of Nazism and Stalinism. And so there was what artists referred to as a crisis of subject matter. Well, if we're not supposed to make pictures of the world as we see it, then what do we make pictures of? And the response was abstract expressionism, so very personal and emotional works of art that did not have a particular subject matter beyond the color and the paint itself. And that's really, to my understanding, the last modern movement. And it was still the last time that there was still a belief in, a celebration of the glories of art and high art, and that it was an important statement, that it was, it was elite. you know, and maybe everybody didn't get it, but that was okay, and it was trying to make this point. And so it was still hopeful in a kind of odd way, I guess I would say, because it was, you know, one man going to make his statement, you know.
Yeah.
And then in the wake of that, the world really falls apart into postmodernism. And I think there are a couple of defining features of that. One feature, I think, is a delight in, you know, irony, or, you know, it's just, oh, isn't that funny or odd that this is the way it is. There's also a sense of appropriation is the term that gets used, kind of stealing other people's work, and often stealing from lots of different people and putting it all together in one big mishmash. And also a real rejection of beauty, which is really a rejection of beauty and a rejection of craftsmanship. And those two things together are really kind of kill me. And there are a number of responses to that. But I guess that's the end of my, you know, story in a tablespoon or something of modern art.
Yeah, well, thank you for kind of giving us the broader scope. I have noticed this trend toward art that seems almost like a game, or is trying to express this abstract idea that is almost more philosophical than some of the older pieces that are just that are depicting beautiful scenes. And I'm wondering if you can shed any light on how we can approach a work of art if we walk into a modern art museum that may just be more about the idea than about, you know, studying the capital B beauty that we study here at Hillsdale.
Well, there are a couple of things. One, you know, you can always read the card on the wall. There's usually some information there. Sometimes I don't agree with it. You know, I'll be the person getting arrested. No, I don't do that. I think one of the important ways to approach that is just always remember, okay, a person made this for some reason. And you're a person, you know. Presumably, you should be able to look at that and have some response to it. Now, there are movements of art that say, oh, they want to make a work that doesn't encourage a particular response, but I think, you know, we can say to ourselves, okay, well, it looks like it's just red, you know, but it's really big, and so maybe I feel really overwhelmed by this, you know. Is this person making some comment on, you know, is this an attempt to depict the sublime, for instance, you know? Could I think about it that way? Is there anything about it that I find the least bit interesting? And if you really want to know, you do have a certain responsibility to maybe read something about it. And I don't, you know, you might say, if you just casually walk by it and say, ugh, I don't get it. Well, yes, valid, right? Do you want to get it? You know, you have to invest some mental energy and some time in trying to figure it out. Now, having done that, you might say, okay, you know, they're interested in conveying a particular philosophical position. There's probably better ways to do that. Next, you know, I'm not saying you can't ever reject anything. Certainly you can. And the other thing is that I think sometimes we get a little too wrapped up in is you're allowed to have just your taste. You know, you should learn where these things come from. You should learn what's trying to be done. But having learned that, it's like any other idea. You can analyze the validity of the argument and say, you know, or, oh yeah, okay, good, I'm with you on this one, right? And maybe you do understand it and you do see where it's coming from, and then you still think, but I don't really want to look at it anymore. And you get to make that decision too.
So as we're learning more about modern art, especially in an age of technology where there's just a lot of art to look at, sometimes that can be very intimidating. You kind of feel like you're drowning in all of it.
Oh, absolutely.
There's so many options out there. Do you have any artists whose work inspires you that we can start with?
Well, it's interesting because there's different artists that I'm drawn to for different reasons. I really love the work of Edouard Vuillard, a 19th century French painter. He was, his mother and aunts and everybody made their living sewing. So he was always sort of surrounded by miles of fabric. And he does all these wonderful paintings of patterns, and you think, you read the title and it says, like Aunt Susie sewing, and you look at the painting and you think, well, I see drapes and I see fabric here and I see this pattern, and then all of a sudden you think, oh, there it is. It's like those funny 3D posters at the mall. I don't know if they still do that anymore. But anyway, he always has a very beautiful composition. And then he kind of plays with our eye with patterns. So I'm fascinated by that. A lot of my inspiration comes from the natural world and not so much from other artists. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that or not. No. But I'm. My husband always says to me, everything is not art history. Because we'll be going somewhere or we'll be looking at something and I'll say, oh, isn't that just like, this painting or, that photograph or this. And he'll just, roll his eyes and say, everything is not our history. I think, oh, but it is, And I think that attitude of being open to all these things and realizing they're part of our basic humanity. Mm-hmm. And, sometimes it's like, sometime in the past, 5 years ago, let's say, there was a Budweiser billboard that showed it was as if something had been dropped into the beer, and so the foam was all coming up into a crown. And of course, Budweiser is the king of beers. All right, so that made sense, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that was really a takeoff on a photograph that had been done. And now that I'm telling you this, his name is completely evaporated from my head. But anyway, he took all these photographs of, using strobe lights and so forth. So, a bullet piercing a card. Or, and then it was all this junior high stuff. A bullet going through a banana, a bullet going through an apple. But you'd get the, and he did have a photograph of a glass of milk and, a drop of milk sort of hitting it, and the wave action and how everything is art history.
Well, as you're talking a little bit about your inspirations, I would love to hear about your work to finish up. You worked with textiles, and I remember your last art show was actually with a photographer here at the college. So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I have always been very interested in layers. Layers from a physical standpoint, layers from a psychological standpoint, layers from a historical standpoint. And of late, I have been particularly interested in landscapes, or I realized that I have taken a gazillion photographs of the cornfields with snow on them, so that there's little stubs coming up, and you can kind of still see the the patterns of the, the lines in the snow. And I was just fascinated by that. And I made a lot of, so I thought, okay, this is, I've got to do this. But I sort of forgot my interest in layers. That sounds terrible. But I was trying to figure out how I was going to make these images of these landscapes. And I had, I don't know, 15 or 20 false starts where I was trying, oh, I know, hey, I'll do it like this. And, make up just a little sample, and you think, no, that doesn't do it. I know. No. And so we had another artist in the gallery a few years back, and he did a lot of paintings, and he did a lot of paintings based on photographs. And so he was talking to Doug Kuhn about his work, and he said, oh, well, yes, I always try for, a foreground that has this, and a midground that has that, and the background has this. And, it was one of those moments, and I thought, let's review foreground, middle ground, background. Well, those would be layers, wouldn't they? And that was the breakthrough moment. And so I could sort of make the background and then pile another layer of shears on top and stitch that, and then put another layer on top and stitch that. And so the sheer cloth added to the atmospheric perspective, and it created the distance that was also there from the shrinking of the objects as they moved away in space. So that was, like most good ideas, you sort of forget them, and then they slap you in the face and think, oh yes, there, I knew that. I knew that all along. So that's where those came from.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. It sounds beautiful, and now I want to see it with that better understanding of your art that I have.
Okay.
And talking with you has been helpful in understanding kind of all of modern art as well. So thanks for joining us, Dr.
Absolutely.
Bushey. And be sure to join us next time on After Office Hours.